So microclimate management practices. Now, at the first glance, people might be thinking that these are just regular soil and water conservation practices, and that's not wrong. A lot of these, the primary intention of these practices is not microclimate management in the majority of the cases, but that's a secondary outcome that we'd like to bring to the foreground, just to show how really everything can influence the microclimate. So we can move to the next slide now. Let me just arrange this like this. Oh, can't. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so making changes in a landscape changes the surrounding microclimate. That's sort of the general assumption that hopefully we'll all end up agreeing with by the end of this masterclass. So any alteration in the landscape, including land and water management practices of farmers and watershed managers, thus affects and alters the microclimate. This then also provides the opportunity to positively modify microclimates and agricultural conditions by implementing sustainable land and water management practices. So as you can see in this image, everything is interrelated. You've got the crop production conditions, you have the farmers and the watershed managers and their practices, and that influences the microclimate, which it's just one cycle that's feeding back into itself. So the scope of the microclimate, it has a horizontal range of centimeters up to hundreds of meters. And the scale on which the interventions can impact the microclimate, it does vary from landscape to landscape. But interventions can be used to improve the immediate environment of a single plant, or it can be used to influence the local environment at a larger scale. We're still talking about the microclimate, but lots of things implemented at a larger scale has a cumulative effect that then influences the local climate. So it's a bit debatable whether we still consider that microclimate or not, but because the changes are happening on the small scale, we're going to go ahead and call it microclimate. Yeah, next slide. So yeah, here we see that schematic again, that's prepared by Madiha and really captures everything together. But yeah, for the rest of the session, we'll look at 19 different land and water management practices, and we'll discuss how they influence the microclimate. And we'll bring all of this together into what we're calling a toolkit for microclimate management. It consists of practices specifically for agriculture, but also tools that can improve the local microclimate in general and not just for agriculture. Yeah, so agriculture really is the main focus, but a lot of the lessons can be applied to other contexts, such as the urban context, for example, where we see things like the urban heat island effect. But let's stick with agriculture because that's where most of us are working. So we'll look at which microclimate management techniques should be applied to a specific site, because this really depends on the context and the particularities of that local landscape. It's very context specific, so there really isn't a sort of one size fits all, but it requires a deep understanding of your agricultural system, your climatic system, and your landscape in general. So you can't really prescribe any set of practices for every situation. So yeah, looking at this, what practices should be implemented where really depends on the unique characteristics, the opportunities, and the challenges. Yeah. Now, these 19 practices that we're about to talk about, they can be categorized into 5 different categories: water conservation practices, regeneration of vegetation practices, soil surface practices, solar radiation management, and wind management. But as we've shown before, this is kind of just because we're humans and we like things to be categorized in a certain way to help us understand. But really, within the microclimatic system, it's very difficult to separate these. You can't really isolate one element from the other because there's a lot of interplay between them. So yeah, microclimate characteristics are examined at multiple scales and the cumulative effects are considered. So yeah, key to this perspective is really to work with the natural system rather than against it. And this will hopefully result in more resilient and productive local ecosystems where natural resources are enhanced. So next slide. Yeah, so let's start looking at the toolkit. Now, familiar with these interventions, and maybe some of us even have experiences. Yeah, exactly. And like I said earlier, typically we think of these in terms of increasing water availability, reducing soil erosion, either for production or for regreening purposes. But we're going to change perspective a little bit. That's what this whole masterclass is about. So looking at things we normally do, but from a new perspective of microclimate management. So yeah, I mean, we can consider them secondary effects, but after this explanation, you'll see how they're really happening in parallel together with the soil and water conservation. So next slide. And we'll start with the check dams. So check dam, just a very quick overview of what they are. It's a small dam constructed across a drainage ditch or a swale or a channel, and it lowers the flow velocity of the water passing through this channel. Oh, we have something popping up here. No, that's okay. Sorry, I will continue. Yeah, so it can be built from a lot of different materials. It can be built with stone, sandbags, built with pea gravel or logs. And the major principle here is that lowering the flow velocity increases the water infiltration and the spread of runoff over time, and that enriches the soil moisture levels of site. A reduction in runoff leads to more rapid recharge of the groundwater table after the dry season and a prolonged water supply due to capillary rise, which was explained by Femke. In fact, a really interesting study by Giulio Castelli, who was meant to be with us today, but unfortunately he couldn't join. But it showed that an increase in catchment capacity to maintain soil moisture in the rainy season also reduced the temperatures of the surrounding area. And we go to the next slide. So we've got another schematic diagram here, which is illustrating how this works. But the process of how increased soil moisture levels resulted in increased air humidity and more moderate air temperature. Yeah, that's all displayed there. So when the soil moisture increases, the evaporation from the soil is enhanced, right? So more water in the soil, more water can evaporate from the soil. So more energy will then be used in these latent heat fluxes, meaning that less energy is available for sensible heat fluxes. So the uptake of latent heat provides an additional daytime cooling effect. Yep, so another effect of increased soil moisture is a reduction in soil erosion by wind. And this is because the bond between the soil particles themselves actually becomes stronger through the action of this capillary rising, and the adhesive forces, so the positive and negative charges in the soil particles, are actually stronger because of the water. So that helps it to stick together and resist the erosion forces of the wind. And next slide. Yeah, so it also helps to balance the soil temperature, and that's by increasing the thermal conductivity. So by adding the water to the soil, you're helping heat to actually move through the soil and not be concentrated in just that top couple of centimeters. So this promotes heat diffusion in the soil and offsets extremes in daytime heating and nocturnal cooling. So it increases the buffering capacity. I mean, normally with soils, we talk about buffering capacity in terms of cation exchanges and that sort of stuff, but now we're talking about it in terms of temperature, and this is really facilitated by the water being in there. So the increase in moisture content also decreases the soil temperature differences between day and nighttime, and this protects the plant root system against sharp and sudden soil temperature changes. So the moderation of soil and air temperature extremes increases a site's resilience considering climate change, right? So one of the major issues with climate change is that we're going to be facing more of these extremes. So wetter soil is actually more resilient in the face of these extreme temperature fluxes. And next slide. So stone bunds. This is the next one of the 19. So let's just, again, very quickly go into what it is. So to create a stone-faced soil bund, stones are arranged in bars to form a strong wall. Very simple concept, but the effect is actually quite interesting. So since the lines are porous, they slow down the runoff rate, spread the water over the field, and enhance water infiltration and reduce soil erosion. So quite multifunctional, these lines of stones. So due to this moisture capture, stone bunds increase the soil moisture levels and therefore have similar effects as check dams. Right, so again, it's about getting water into the soil, but not just for irrigating the plants, but also for regulating the microclimate. Yeah, they balance the soil temperature due to their higher thermal conductivity of the soil, and they also increase air humidity and moderate the air temperature. Next slide. Yeah, so here we have a really nice image that just shows how, after a few rains, these stone bunds can have a huge difference. So you can see that stone bund running right across the middle of the field there, and you can see that it's just much greener. There's a lot more water in that soil, and the plants have noticed, and they're making the most of it. Next slide. So stone bunds also impact the microclimate through their high heat capacity. This is something we don't normally think about, or at least I didn't normally think about. So when the incoming energy during the day is high, this warms up the stones and makes the stone bunds a heat source at night. So this is the concept of thermal mass for those who are familiar with it. It helps to prevent nearby crops from night frost particularly. Yeah, and the idea here is that you have a high density object that's constantly absorbing that solar radiation, and then once that solar radiation stops, the process is reversed and it's releasing this long wave radiation. Another thing which maybe we don't always consider is the color of the stone actually makes quite a difference, and it links back to the albedo effect. So using light colored stone walls results in extra shortwave radiation reflected onto nearby crops. So there actually is a possibility, and there's reason to consider this, that yeah, if you have white stones, they're kind of acting as a mirror with that solar radiation and bouncing it back onto the plants. So, and also a smaller consideration, because these aren't normally very high, but because they are vertical structures on the site, they also lower the wind speed when they're placed perpendicular to the prevailing wind direction. So they can really be multifunctional depending on how you're thinking about them and incorporating them into the design of the farm. And the next practices we'll look at are soil bunds. Soil bunds, very, very similar to stone-faced bunds. The water is impounded behind the bund on the contour level and overflowing eventually with water spreading onto the lower tier of bunds. These are normally along the contour on a slope. And this creates a run-on structure which can create ponding of runoff water. Now this reduces the runoff and spreads the water more evenly, and the soil bunds increase soil moisture levels and reduce soil erosion. And next slide. We've got the just one more thing about the soil bunds actually. So we can assume that that the impacts on microclimate are actually very similar for this, as explained for the stone bunds and the soil bunds, because essentially the effect is very similar with the soil moisture and the reduced soil erosion. So a lot of these actually have overlapping impacts, but it's just a matter of highlighting that we can think about them in a different way. So now we'll move on to the eyebrow terraces. Yeah. Good. So eyebrow terraces are circular stone structures. It's one thing to say, circular stone structures, applicable in steep and degraded hillsides and community closures. So the objective of eyebrow terraces is to harvest moisture, just like the others. And by, again, increasing the soil moisture level and reducing soil erosion by slowing down the runoff, eyebrow terraces are important measures in maintaining the soil's quality. And we'll move on to the next one. This is very similar to the example that Francesco gave in the Azores, but it's on an, well, not so nearby, but on the island of Lanzarote. So an example of successful use of eyebrow terraces and how this improved the microclimate can be found in Lanzarote, which is a volcanic island. A long time ago, in 1730, there was a devastating volcanic eruption on the island, and the eruption covered the cereal fields with a thick, dark mantle that was very difficult to work and that really didn't retain much water. So the farmers then shifted from cereal to grape cultivation, and they had to show extreme adaptive capacity for this and really strive to work with nature to maximize agricultural land productivity under these new extreme environmental conditions. So also to compound how difficult this was for them, the island has an average rainfall of only 100 millimeters per year and really extreme winds, very exposed to the ocean. So how did the farmers enable the thriving of their crops despite this water scarcity and extreme wind? The answer is in fact eyebrow terraces. Yeah, so you can see in this image, the eyebrow terraces protect the vines against the wind and they minimize evapotranspiration, particularly, evapotranspiration, and they maintain the soil moisture as much as possible. So the eyebrow terraces also reduce soil erosion and prevent the development and spread of fungi and pathogens. So with the help of these eyebrows, the farmers are able to cultivate their vine grapes in an environment that's really not suitable for it. So they can really make a difference. Very similar, at least in shape, is the semicircular bunds on the next slide. Yes. So semicircular bunds, they're also half circle shaped, but these are basins that are dug into the earth. So they also harvest runoff and they facilitate the infiltration of water into the soil. And it's very similar to the eyebrow terraces in that respect. Something a bit different here, and kind of a combination of them, is tied ridges. So these, you can think of them as small rectangular series of basins, and they're formed in the cultivated fields furrows. Right, so tie ridging increases the surface water storage capacity and allows more time for rainfall to infiltrate in the soil. And again, these are done all along the contour, and the idea is to just capture as much of this water and slow it down as it passes through the landscape. And trenches. Yeah, so trenches, they are large and deep pits constructed along the contours to collect and store rainfall water. This rainwater harvesting enhances the soil moisture levels. And something that's very interesting that trenches do, which the other practices so far haven't really done, is that they gather and keep the rain during the rain season, which creates standing surface water. Yeah, so it increases the water surfaces on a site. So the water surfaces are actually poor reflectors of solar radiation, and they serve as an effective sink for solar energy. So they're just absorbing that during the day when it's available. So a lot of these trenches then absorb the solar energy and radiate it back at night. Similar to the stone bunds, you've got this release of thermal energy at night once the sun is gone. And this can help in places where frost is an issue, for example, but just in general, it's good for moderating temperature extremes. Yep, and then we have RIDGE-FURROW planting. Now, this style of planting actually influences a lot of different aspects of the microclimate. So the practice consists of making furrows and ridges in the land on which the crop rows can be planted. So the water is harvested in the furrows, and this improves the drainage during the rainy seasons, and it allows the excess moisture to drain off the fields to the lower channels. So this reduces soil erosion induced by water and spreads the water out more evenly. So ridge and furrow planting also increases the in-situ water utilization efficiency and positively affects soil moisture. So the impacts on the microclimate are very similar. When you have increased soil moisture, of course, you're lowering the temperatures, you're buffering, you're increasing the conductivity, the thermal conductivity of the soil. But also, it's interesting to consider what it does to solar radiation and how the interaction basically between the crop and solar radiation when you're using this type of practice. So the slope of a site affects the absorbed radiation intensity, as we've already covered, but in this case, what you're creating is a lot of very small slopes, and between those, you're creating really big differences in the amount of energy that they're being received. So you're manipulating the geometry of the receiving surfaces. Now, this can be particularly useful even in temperate climates. Not all of this needs to be in the tropics or subtropics, but for example, here in the springtime, when the sun is still not as high as it normally gets, this can really maximize the amount of solar radiation being absorbed by that topsoil where your seeds are, and therefore triggering germination earlier than they would be triggered if it was just a flat field. And next one, now this is one of the most significant shifts in the geometry of the land. So terraces are earth embankments, channels, or combinations constructed across the slope at suitable spacing and acceptable grades. By reducing the steepness, terracing can help erosion control, runoff reduction, and soil water recharge. This runoff reduction and soil water recharge increases the soil moisture levels of a site, and by increasing the soil moisture, the soil and the air temperature get more balanced with that buffering capacity, and air humidity increases. But again, what this does is it also creates an interaction with solar radiation. So you can think if, for example, you've got a slope that on one side is facing south and on one side is facing north, and instead of leaving it as sloping terrain, you're terracing it and creating these flat areas. You're increasing the surface area of the slope that is exposed to solar radiation, and like that you're really maximizing the amount of solar radiation that you can absorb just by spreading things out on a more horizontal plane rather than a sloping one. And talking about slopes, one practice that we'll talk about is contour farming. So contour farming is the practice of all farming operations performed along the field's slope contour. So that means around the hill instead of up and down the hill. Now, this is something that ever since secondary school, at least for me at least, they've always told us you have to go along the hill and not up and down. But the main reason that this is promoted is soil erosion. But what it also does is it slows down the runoff. And by slowing down the runoff, again, we have more infiltration. And again, we're increasing soil moisture, soil humidity, thermal conductivity of the soil. So again, very similar impacts on the microclimate as the previous examples. And yeah, we can move on to the next one, I think. So here's just an example from Ethiopia. So it's something that ever since I started having anything to do with projects in Ethiopia has always really impressed me, the way they have these annual watershed campaigns where they're mobilizing whole communities to just do the soil and water conservation work that needs to be done in their local watersheds. And this I think can really inspire us and give us hope for how we can go from microclimate at sort of a field or a plant level to, shall we call it, the local climate or the landscape climate. Again, by making these cumulative changes in the microclimate, you can really have a large impact over a larger area. So yeah, in Ethiopia, there's large-scale landscape restoration practices implemented to increase soil moisture and reduce runoff losses. And some research, again by Giulio Castelli, showed that after a full campaign of this, the general temperature of a watershed that was restored was actually 1.74 degrees Celsius lower, which doesn't sound like much, but that's an average value, which means that, yeah, it's pretty significant to reach that number. So it really shows how, yeah, these micro changes can have a macro effect at the local and landscape level. And with this example, I'd really like to talk to you guys in the audience, because I'm sure some of the people here have some experience with either some of the practices that I've mentioned or similar ones. And if you do have any of these examples, I'd really like to hear them at this point. And I think we can have a small discussion about how, yeah, when we do these things, it's really soil and water conservation, but very few people talk about how this is actually influencing other conditions on the farm, such as wind or solar radiation or humidity, for example. So yeah, I'm opening it up to you guys. And if you have anything to add on to this, please just unmute yourself or put it in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand. And I haven't been looking at the chat, so I don't know if there's anything in there, Femke.
Nancy mentioned that she has some experience with cycles in Ethiopia. Water spreading structures mentioned.
Oh, yeah. Again, that I guess just slows down the water as it moves through the landscape.
Yeah.
Creates that buffering capacity in the soil. Yeah, so I'm getting some messages that the audio is a bit unclear. Maybe it's my voice, but maybe it's my laptop. So I'd just like to check, is it clear?
Jan, it is a bit like there's some noise in it, and also with Femke. Maybe the two of you are interfering. Could be, I don't know, because you're not in the same room, I guess.
No, we are in the same room. Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. If one moves to another room, it might be might solve the problem actually.
Yeah. So do you have yours muted?
No.
Ja, that's fine.
Ja, doe maar even, anders lijkt het de hele diepe stem hebt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I hear some voices coming through. I think
this is from Rain office in Amsterdam. We did not raise our hand, but it's four of us together. No, I'm really enjoying it. It's really triggering a lot of things in the imagination. I was wondering to what extent, because I think from your examples, they're mostly rural examples, but I'm usually very struck by the impact of small parks or plantations or whatever in the city. And I think particularly in the Netherlands, but in many other cities as well, you have a lot of these discussions around heat islands in the city. So I suppose that could be an additional point of interest, or is that where the concept of microclimate comes to an end somehow?
No, not at all. I mean, what you mentioned there is something that's very real, the urban heat island effect. I mean, even I'm remembering my bachelor studies at the University of Malta, because Malta is not just an island, but it's very urban. So the urban heat island is really a hot topic of research there. And there's a lot in common between what's being researched for these urban environments and also what the research we're doing in the more rural environments. And of course, you're not going to dig soil buns down a main street in an urban area, but particularly regreening is being shown to have a really significant impact in urban areas. And we're going to go a bit into greening and vegetation and the impact that has on microclimate a bit later in this presentation. But yeah, it's a really good point, Martin. And the lessons that we can take away about microclimate, I think, can be applied to a number of other contexts and situations. But then, like I said earlier, there's no silver bullet for this. There's no blanket recommendation for microclimate. You really need to understand the particular environment, the particular landscape, and also the opportunities that are available in it. So it does take a bit of background research, but I think microclimate solutions really are all around us. And it's this shift in perspective of looking at the multifunctionality of these practices. And that's most likely where you'll find the solution. Anything else from the audience, or I can move on to
Can I add something?
Yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something on microclimate using ZIPITs. I find it very interesting and a triple win one. Like, for example, when I look at in Kitui, for example, in Kenya, where we have some projects, you find farmers who have adopted this. They're able to grow, for example, 5 maize in one hole. At the same time, they add legumes, meaning they have a double harvest, and also they've increased the nutrient content of their soil, and have also reduced the runoff and also evapotranspiration. So it's a good technique that can be adopted in most of the dry places.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, in fact, Nancy, I'd be really interested to talk to you about that in a bit more detail later. But yeah, okay. there's all these different practices that yeah, like for example, you mentioned mixing the crops together. Typically, you do that for the nutrient cycling between the crops, but also taking this microclimate perspective makes you realize that what you're doing is actually a lot more than that. So yeah, I really like these examples that are coming up. I see Frank also has his hand up, so I'm going to give the floor to him for a bit.
Yeah, I think what Nancy's saying, that is quite interesting, because I think in a lot of crops, for instance, you have shade trees. So, I mean, maybe we need to also explore that a bit more. Then what I was thinking of was, mulching. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What we do in China is really interesting. I won't say it's a good practice, but they do a lot of plastic mulching, and it has several purposes. Also to retain the soil moisture, so the soil moisture doesn't evaporate. Yeah. But the other one is to also regulate the soil temperature, and so they have white mulch, white plastic mulch, and black plastic mulch. So the black plastic mulch really heats up the soil, and the other one sort of cools it down. So yeah, I think even with sort of natural mulches, it might be something to explore a bit as well, because I guess some leaves have a different effect than other leaves.
Mm-hmm.
Could be also part of the repertoire.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Frank. In fact, mulching is in the next part of this presentation, because what we dealt with now was what did we call them? The soil
conservation.
Yeah, the soil conservation practices, and yeah, one of the sections here is going to be about these soil surface practices such as mulching that we can do. And like you rightly mentioned, the color and the composition of the mulch can have a big impact, not just on what it's releasing into the soil, but also how it's interacting with the microclimate. Yeah, I see another hand there from Thijs.
Yeah, hi. I thought I'd just share that we, like I said, we do regreening programs in Tanzania and in Kenya. In Tanzania, we also do rainwater harvesting through Fanya chini. And in Kenya, we implement these soil bunds, the half-moon shaped soil bunds. I think so far we've dug, I don't know off the top of my head, I think around 180,000 of them. And lately we've also been playing around with heat cameras and soil temperature sensors. And yeah, from these you can clearly see the impact on soil temperature, also soil moisture with a different sensor. But so we do know that we see that the impact of these water harvesting techniques on different aspects of the microclimate. But yeah, so far we haven't really found a way, or we don't really know how to integrate that into program monitoring on a larger scale. So yeah, perhaps it would be nice to have a chat about that sometime. Or I don't know if you go a bit more into detail further on in the presentation. Cool. I'm looking forward to that. But yeah.
Yeah. No. Thanks for bringing up that example, Thijs. And it's really interesting to know that you're already looking at this with thermal imaging and with soil sensors. In fact, that's what the third section of this masterclass is all about. So how we're going to monitor these changes in the microclimate, because we've gotten really good at monitoring, water harvesting and water retention capacity in the soil. So now we're looking at this as the next step in sort of project intervention monitoring. Actually to bring this to the foreground, how we're influencing the microclimate. So yeah, if you stick around for the third section, you'd probably be quite interested in that. Yeah, great.
Perfect, thanks.
Yeah, we'll even have some people from our neighbors at Area Watch contributing to that discussion. So that should be really interesting. All right, perfect. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next section then, unless Miriam?
Oh, sorry that we were making noise.
Oh, no, that's okay. I thought you were going to step in with something, but that's fine. So we can move on to the next slide then. Yeah, so regreening, which is precisely what Thijs was talking about earlier. So how increasing vegetation in an area can influence the microclimate. It might come as no surprise, but in a lot of ways. So we'll start with revegetation. So this is replacing lost vegetation in an area. So it's based on a historical reference point where an area was greener than it currently is and trying to bring it closer to that. So due to the essential role of vegetation in the hydrological cycle, the regeneration and increasing of natural vegetation is a critical approach in increasing the water buffer. So vegetation affects the microclimate in several ways. First, the vegetation impacts the energy balance of a place. It affects how much heat is absorbed and how much is radiated. So by absorbing and reflecting incoming radiation before it reaches the soil, vegetation hinders the increase of ground temperature in the daytime, and it also hinders the cooling off in the nighttime. So this gives more moderate temperature, so it's cutting off sort of the extremes in that temperature fluctuation. So vegetation, as we know, can also retain moisture, but particularly in the air in the form of humidity. The roots of the vegetation and enhanced soil organic matter levels from the litter also improve the soil structure and the microbiological life that's living in there. So this again determines the soil's porosity and its water holding capacity, which, as we discussed earlier a couple of times, influences the microclimate. So the hope is that once the vegetation levels are restored closer to their historical levels, then regeneration of the area should actually accelerate because the microclimate conditions are brought closer to the original, so to speak, climatic conditions that there were before the degradation happened. So the native or the indigenous microbiology and the plant life should then bounce back and start to thrive because conditions are similar to the optimum conditions they were experiencing before. And this can have a positive knock-on effect and stabilize the climatic conditions a bit. Next slide. Yeah, so here's an example, but yeah, we had a very similar one from Thijs, of course, or maybe even the same one. I'm not sure, but this is also about just Liggett's work, which we were helping with the monitoring of, and the research that we did in this area by by a previous colleague, Lorenzo, found that a difference in land surface temperature of up to 1.32 degrees. This is between areas with fewer trees and regions with more trees. So it really does have an impact, and quite quickly. So a 10% tree canopy cover threshold is what you need to start seeing these effects on temperature moderation. And we can move on to the next one. So an increase in vegetation cover can also increase rainfall reliability, because everything is connected. What's happening on the ground is connected to what's happening in the sky. So more vegetation allows for more soil moisture, more evapotranspiration, and a decrease in land surface temperature. An increase in soil moisture enhances evaporation and root moisture absorption, and therefore transpiration through the plants. So the plants are releasing more water vapor into the air. So both of these processes contribute to the hydrological cycle and enhance precipitation. So in this way, the local environment can be improved. So this is, again, one of those ways how we go from microclimate to local climate. So actually a study conducted in Medogo watershed in northern Ethiopia stated that an increasing vegetation cover improved its local climate. The study respondents, they confirmed that the hot and dry air that previously dominated the area in the watershed was replaced by a moister and cooler air that was blowing through and cooling down the area. So again, just by increasing the vegetation cover by as little as 10%, you start to actually tangibly feel these differences. And here we have some nice quotes for people who participated in the study. So the acacia trees that were regenerated due to the intervention are effective to conserve moisture and act as a windbreak and as a living fence. So that's that multifunctionality. They also work as a soil erosion prevention. And this was in 2016 in the Raya Valley. And another quote, so there is a temperature difference. Due to the trees that grow in the revegetated area, it is much cooler. It also makes us happy to be around the greener area. So this is an interesting concept as well. Maybe we have an internal microclimate that's also positively influenced by vegetation, but that's a whole other. Anyway, next slide. On-farm agroforestry. So this is the planting of trees in the farm. So agroforestry uses trees on the same site as crops in some form of spatial arrangement or temporal sequence. So on the left, you can see a picture of alley farming. So crops are cultivated in between rows of trees, normally with about 4 meters difference, but it does vary depending on the crop and the tree. And on the right, you see multi-strata agroforestry systems. So that's really taking that concept of stacking in time and space to allow for different levels of vegetation and different levels of productivity within a small space. And if we move on, we have a schematic version showing some of the differences. So the effect of trees on the microclimate is indicated here. It shows that trees increase the evaporation fluxes compared to the sensible heat fluxes, resulting in an overall cooling effect. Trees also affect the solar radiation on a site, and when a dense canopy forms an active surface above the crop zone, this intercepts much of the solar radiation, so you're getting less of that harsh direct solar radiation onto your crop. Trees also affect the wind speed, of course, and the direction of the wind on a site. So a study from Hengsijk, I think is how you say it. Yeah, showed that reforestation practices resulted in less than 15% erosion since trees improved water infiltration and reduced runoff. The tree roots basically act to anchor the soil, and that creates this pretty great package of not just improving soil conditions, but also improving the microclimatic conditions. And if we move on to the next slide, we have a slightly different version of how vegetation can help, and this is the vegetative buffers or grass strips. So what these are basically are grasses that are planted in dense strips along the contour, just like the contour bunds we discussed earlier. They create a more or less permeable, but semi-permeable barrier that minimizes soil erosion and runoff through a water filtering process. So with this, the vegetation buffer increases the soil moisture. It therefore has the same effect on the microclimate as we discussed earlier, but the added benefit of you've got biomass growing there. So depending on what grasses you use, these could be used, for example, in cut and carry systems or for handicrafts or weaving. It really depends on the situation and what's most beneficial to the area. So that's a little bit about the vegetation practices that we've analyzed so far in our study of the microclimate. And once again, I'm going to give a few minutes to the people in the audience here, just to see if you've got any examples that I didn't mention. All right, Anna, you think it's quiet here, which is fine. That's okay.
No, Jean, can I interrupt?
Of course you
Francesco
can.
here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the vegetation management, let's say, in the microclimate dialogue, let's say, is very important. And I think is also very important within the field, how the crops interact with each other. So, for example, if you have a taller crop that can shade a less heat-tolerant crop, that can be quite effective. So also the annual crops, not only the interaction between annual crops and perennial plants like trees. I think that's also something that can be quite effective and needs more attention, certainly.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you here. And if I'm not mistaken, what you're talking about is, for example, shade-grown coffee, right? Where you have one tree that prefers a more shady environment, so you grow another tree next to it that's providing that microclimate for it.
Yeah. Yeah, but even between annual crops. So if you think of, for example, pole beans that are climbers that go to a higher level, can provide the shade to a lettuce nearby. Or something I saw once in Ethiopia, in Tigray, I saw some farmers leaving some stalks of maize on one side of the field, just one line, and I was wondering why. And those stalks were upwind, and they were sheltering other crops that were sown downwind, if not strong, some beans. So it was acting as a windbreak, but probably also as shade, depending on the orientation. Yeah,
no, that's a good point. And yeah, it's a good way of looking at everything on the farm as a resource also, because so you could leave, for example, these stalks of the corn, like you said, and they're acting as a windbreak, but potentially once the crop in the field has established a bit more, you can actually harvest that and use the biomass for something else.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, also in the, what's it called, the Three Sisters combination from the Native American ones, where you've got the pumpkin at the bottom and that's being shaded by the corn, and also creating a nice cover on the soil to reduce evaporation. Yeah, there's a lot of considerations. I mean, in agroecology, they talk about the synergies and companion planting, but a lot of that is really based on what's happening under the soil and the interactions of the chemicals and the roots between these plants. But also considering shading and windbreaking is another element that can help us in designing these farms, I think.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, thanks for that. Good comments. Nice. All right. Soil surface practices, shall we? Let's get into it. So, here we're going to talk about two specific practices that we've bundled as soil surface practices, and these are conservation, tillage, and mulching, like Frank mentioned. So both of these come highly recommended in general within regenerative agriculture and organic agriculture, and so we were quite familiar with their advertised benefits of reducing erosion, promoting microbiology, increasing soil carbon and the soil structure. But again, let's keep this microclimate perspective and kind of re-examine these practices and see what they're doing to the microclimate variables we discussed. So, conservation tillage. It's another way of saying minimum or no tillage. It's a practice of just enough tillage to allow the seeds to take hold in the ground, and conservation tillage decreases soil disturbance and improves soil aggregate stability. This improves water infiltration and increases soil moisture and reduces runoff and soil erosion. So this then benefits the soil sediments and nutrients. So conservation tillage also leads to reduced soil temperatures compared to conventional tillage. And the process behind this is that it's called thermal admittance differences. So basically having that heat flux that happens at the surface happening at a deeper depth. So basically, when you leave that soil structure intact, it allows that heat flux to happen at a deeper level, right? Right. Just double checking. Yeah. And it leads to a more moderate upper profile of the soil. So what you have is that radiative heating that's happening on the soil surface isn't trapped within that first few centimeters. But when you have this good soil structure, it's able to there's this exchange between the deeper levels, and that spreads that heat out a bit more evenly. Next slide. So, mulching. A lot of this was already covered by Frank. It's a really good example. Mulch forms a barrier to the heat and the vapor flow from the soil, and it inhibits heat and moisture exchanges with the atmosphere. So it's creating this blanket between the soil and the atmosphere. So mulching decreases the evaporation rate, enhances infiltration, and therefore increases moisture conservation. By blocking the transport of vapor out of the soil, the water availability for crops is enhanced by lowering the evaporation rate directly from the soil. Another effect is that the soil temperature becomes more moderate. Again, you've got this sort of buffering capability where the mulch is absorbing some of that excess heat that we don't necessarily want to penetrate down to the soil. But the impact of mulching on the microclimate really depends on the type of mulch that's used. So its effects will rely on the color and whether it's impervious to water or not. For example, an organic mulch or a plastic mulch. Surface application of pale materials such as kaolin or ash, they increase the soil surface albedo, so more reflectance, and can decrease soil temperatures by reflecting that solar radiation. Dark materials such as coal dust or charcoal or darkly colored wood chips can have the opposite impact and increase soil temperatures. Mulching also affects wind and water erosion. It reduces the rate at which soil erosion occurs from rain, hail, runoff, and because of the mulch layer's protective properties, if you compare mulched and unmulched areas, this is from a study by Araya and Stronsnyder. If you compare these two, it shows that runoff is actually reduced by up to 69% for the mulched area. So it really does have a significant impact. And we do have a bit of time for some more examples from the audience if you'd like to chip in. But yeah, for now, these are the practices that we're considering, soil surface practices that we've considered for microclimate analysis so far. But of course, there's a lot more being done. And if anyone wants to bring a different practice to the table, please go ahead. Yeah, actually, I'm going to keep going just because I took a look at the time. And yeah, let's get through these practices. But of course, there's plenty of time to discuss at the end of the session or in the chat box if you'd like to add anything. But let's take a look at solar radiation management. Now, this is something that we don't normally think about because we take solar radiation as a constant and not really a variable that we have control over. But it's the way that we interact with the solar radiation that we do have control over, or that we can manage at least. So, next slide. So, orientation. Yeah, so this is modifying or planning out the orientation of the rows, either north-south or west-east or any combination of those. So modification of solar radiation. In the northern hemisphere, for example, if you do a north-south orientation, then you have a lot more solar radiation actually reaching your crops because they're not shading each other. And this is based on the assumption that the spacing between rows is actually larger than the spacing inside the row. And that's why you have less shading on each other if you choose this orientation. What you also do in this case is you reduce the amount of solar radiation that's hitting the bare soil in between the rows. So that's worth considering as well. What you might also want to consider when thinking about row orientation is the wind direction and whether you want that wind to channel straight through, or if you're blocking it in some way, maybe with a taller crop on one side. So there's a lot to consider when it comes to row orientation and also spacing. So row spacing can maximize or minimize light penetration and the trapping of short and long wave radiation. This influences the microclimate, of course. So the wider the row spacing, the lower the relative humidity levels. And the smaller the rows, the lower the soil temperature and soil evaporation rates. It's very, very similar, just talking about the spacing inside the row. However, for this, there's also agronomic considerations you need to take into account, and that is, what is your crop? How does it interact, being closer or further away from a crop that's similar to it or different to it. So it's just one more layer of considerations when you're designing and planning out the farm. And the next one we'd like to talk about is shading. And this was already hinted at by Francesco. Of course, shading modifies the energy balance at the soil surface and crop canopy. So a lot of what I've seen in Ethiopia is they actually use bundled grasses in, for example, tree nurseries to create a more moderate temperature for the young seedlings until they're strong enough to take it. And like Francesco mentioned, you can actually, when it's available, you can buy different materials that actually tell you how much of the solar radiation they're filtering out. So, for example, a 50% shading or 25% shading, and you can just choose depending on your crop's conditions and the particular conditions of your farm. An interesting secondary effect of this is that it also reduces wind speed by just reducing the amount of area where the wind can directly intercept your crops. Yeah, and this is actually a photo of Francesco's farm. So thanks for the example, Francesco. Much appreciated. And I'm just going to skip right ahead to the last practice that we're going to talk about in this section, which is wind management, particularly through the use of windbreaks. Yeah. So the length, width, and height of the material can vary considerably. For example, you can use a bunch of reeds bundled together as a windbreak, or you can plant trees. Hedges, rows, bushes, it all works as long as it's intercepting the dominant wind direction. So the longer a windbreak, the more constant its influence. But there's some nuances to this, as we can see in the next slide. So what you want with a windbreak is you don't actually want it to be a solid wall, because what that creates is a lot of turbulence when then the wind comes crashing back down after going over this obstacle. So you do want a slightly porous windbreak, as you can see in this. It's a pretty good illustration, to be honest, because when you do have those holes, it creates a much more stable, stable wind. There's actually, there's different measurements and different equations you can use to see how high your windbreak is, what your wind speed is, and it will tell you where the wind is going to be coming crashing back down on your field. So ideally, you want something that's high enough and porous enough to just take away most of the harshness from the wind that's intercepting your crops. And yeah, we also have this schematic diagram here that shows how everything is connected. So it's mechanical protection of the crops. It reduces soil erosion. It lowers the evaporation processes, which improves water use efficiency. It's higher daytime and lower nighttime temperatures because you're removing that cooling effect of the wind, or at least partially removing it. And yeah, soil temperatures are substantially higher in sheltered areas. You don't have that cooling breeze effect. This allows for more rapid root respiration and seed germination and organic matter decomposition. Here is an example of how stone can be used as windbreak. This is actually from the Azores Islands, which again Francesco mentioned. I'm not sure if these are Francesco's photos, maybe, but yeah, with a bit of creativity, you can find lots of ways to reduce the harshness of the wind on your farm. And yeah, those are the 19 practices we said we would go through, and that's them. So hopefully what this has done is showed you that we can think about things in a different way. When we take this perspective of looking at the microclimate, you can look at something that you've been practicing for maybe the past decade or so, like a stone bund, and realize that the impact the stone bund is having is a lot more far-reaching than simply the retention of water and the reduction of soil erosion. So if anything, I hope that that's a takeaway that we got from this session. In the next session, Bente will be looking at how we're monitoring microclimates, and also we'll have some people from ERIWatch talking about how they're working towards monitoring microclimates.